Geocinema, project that examines infrastructures on Earth sensing data and forms of cinema. She holds master degrees in the art history from the University of New York and analytical chemistry from the Kyiv National University. So please welcome Ася.
Can you hear me well? We can turn the lights off. Was it like this with Geert's presentation? Yep. Yeah? Okay. Okay, so many thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be here and to present some of the work that I've been doing artistically and collaboratively under the name of Geocinema together with filmmaker Solveig Suess, who I wish was here today with me. Broadly speaking, we've been plotting towards a film about the making of Earth while looking at the infrastructures of Earth sensing as forms of cinema, with various imaging techniques constituting largely distributed cinematic apparatus. Today, I'll focus less on the cinema, but rather on political imagination and economy that enables it. I will also slip in some of the working footage in the presentation, so just to keep you entertained. But before I do, I want to thank Svetlana for inviting me, and also thanks to the entire team of Visual Culture Research Center for securing this timely gathering here in Kyiv. So I will start with this image that I found in Sriracha, the only satellite ground station in Thailand. We were mainly caught by the textures of this image, thinking this was a raw image before the set of correction was applied to remove noise coming from clouds and other atmospheric conditions. When asking a member staff about this image, they said that this was somewhere in Australia, but only after a bit of a time, we realized that it was not just somewhere in Australia. This was Tingatingana, a calibration site. Because of its incredibly stable site conditions and specific reflective characteristic of its surface, this specific patch of land is being used for a radiometric calibration of satellites. To put it simply, what happens between the land and the satellite is not just taking images of the passive territories, but more of the interaction between the two. Multiple sensors within the imaging mechanism of the satellite translate various chemical and mechanical stimuli coming from air, light, reflectance on the ground in real time. And while processing that information, they trigger specific corrective responses towards the best possible scenario for the image acquisition. When calibrated properly, every raw image is a container of data that can be algorithmically extracted, processed, and analyzed for quantities and qualities of the Earth's crust, its climates, and also importantly, to be able to understand differences and see patterns of change over time, allowing for a prediction of future behavior. What is important here is that the land is not just a fixed backdrop against which the imaging apparatus is being mobilized. Environment, as Jennifer Gabris puts it, is not a ground or fundamental condition against which sensor technologies form, but rather develops with and through sensor technologies as they take hold and concrete in these contexts. It co-composes that image by feeding into the intelligent algorithmic speculation on how to image best and what defines the parameters of quality. Thus, what characterizes these images is their programmability. Here, processes of calibration between sensing devices and geological processes program certain environments which are governed through images, or rather through the invisible layers of computation within them. So while these algorithms that mobilize these images are not directly visible or are not perceived for themselves, we as Geocinema turn to infrastructures and actors that enable them. So it was early December last year when I had an impromptu conversation with Alexander, who was a United Nations environment representative. We sat in a restaurant inside a luxurious hotel in Tengchong, southern China, where he sketched out a series of simple graphs in a conference notebook, narrating for me scenes of possible futures. We have now entered, he told me, the unstable transitional period that might take 2 to 3 decades before the new geopolitical order is established. He spoke on the general consensus that the promise of a stable legal order established from the united international cooperation of nations following the 2 world wars has been in stagnation for a while now. This, topped with the parallel crisis of Western democracy and with ongoing global ecological turmoil, convinces him that these changes are inevitable. The processes of redistributing global powers will not be directly visible, as the current attempts to expand spheres of socio-political and economic influence no longer demand the invasion of territories. They instead operate through data, through the seemingly invisible and the not necessarily territorial. It is the understanding of these tectonic shifts in the world's geopolitical mechanisms that drew an array of representatives and actors to come to the third Digital Belt and Road Conference to seek cooperation with China's Belt and Road Initiative, deemed as the project of the 21st century. Many seemed convinced of new promises this new international order would bring, yet none of this was part of the official vocabulary of the conference, and instead the international community cheered to the shared enthusiasm of technological promises to battle climate change with big data. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the New Silk Road, this is the Chinese state-led main foreign policy project leading a series of investments into the construction across Asia, Europe, and Africa. It promises global connectivity through transnational infrastructures such as telecommunication lines, oil pipelines, railways, highways, and ports. The Big Earth Science Engineering project was announced here with the aim to synchronize Earth observation data by building an international and centralized platform. This current model of the program was framed as a way to understand the ecosystem, acting as an umbrella supporting further exchange of data and information under the mandate to study past climates towards future protection. By this understanding of the Earth, the project aims to eventually be instrumental in managing disasters and other risks, where markets, populations, and climates can be algorithmically calculable and mappable as the nearest future forecasts. The Digital Belt and Road program itself was conceived 2 years earlier as a data gateway of the Belt and Road Infrastructural Initiative, with a rough timeline of 10 years. By the end of 2018, it launched 8 international centers on 4 continents, with many more to come. During the conference, potential partners lined up to pitch their agendas with attempts to join this ever-expanding network. While focusing predominantly on remote sensing and socioeconomic data, DBAR is an infrastructure enabler that operates under the guise of scientific exchange and with the green rhetoric of sustainable development. The main emphasis here is made on so-called data-poor countries, with the underlying claim that collecting the data of or for developing countries will lead to further ecological certainty. What comes instead are new forms of governing that operate through imaging, with data being extracted from Earth observation used as bargaining chips for emerging economies. The project of Digital Belt and Road was the starting point of our research and led us to China. It was born out of the Chinese Science Academy with its operation based in the newly built campus of the Institute of Remote Sensing and Digital Earth in Beijing. This was a massive cinema theater that resembles a globe. It centers the campus, pivoting separate departments and buildings around it. While on a visit to its campus a few months prior to the conference, we entered the cinema globe to find it empty and idle, with the projectors humming steadily in anticipation of 3D film that was about to be shown to us as outsider guests. As the projection started, we wore our 3D glasses to be immersed in a short film led by a bombastic American narrator who outlined humanity's main challenges with climate change, unveiling DBAR as solution to these problems. The name of the institute was directly inspired by a speech given by Al Gore, made in 1998, claiming a demand for a digital Earth, a multi-resolution, 3-dimensional virtual representation of the planet, into which vast quantities of georeference data can be embedded. We learned that Al Gore still consults Chinese Academy of Science, and what struck us here was how this project of totality wasn't just a vision of China's own. It has always been one of which included a series of influences, collaborations, abiding by no clear Chinese and the rest divisions. It was here where we met with Professor Li, who is head of the Big Data Working Group.
The fact that it's a signal to us is just a signal, it's not a picture. It's a signal picture. And then process with the validation from like the picture to be dead. It's our data. And the scientists have the data to be information. And the government likes information to be knowledge. So it's the life cycle of the data. It's a very long life cycle. So for our institute, some departments is working on the signal. Some department working on the data. Some department working on the information. So it's why our definition of different definitions.
So he continued on with his presentation to describe how these issues presented to us are largely to do with communication. Communication of scientific knowledge around how the Earth is changing, between the facts and our understanding of it structurally, the communication between technical providers and decision makers, with the growing need for bureaucratic departments being able to communicate with each other. While this remains largely an unsolved design issue, this current DEBAR project pushes forth the functioning of a digital nervous system of the globe, actively informing about events happening on or close to the Earth's surface by connecting to sensor networks and situation-aware systems, where the Earth is meant to be rendered, read, and understood to reduce the uncertainty of the future. Spanning from the 27 satellite missions, supercomputers in Jinan and Wuxi, among others, 4 satellite ground stations within China's borders, various associative institutions across the world, and fiber optic cables connecting all of them, this vastly distributed data platform promises to provide users with a way to process big Earth data and use them for further scientific policy or other data translations. The importance of representational technology remains integral to the running of this vast machine, or planetary-scale scientific projects such as DEBAR. Yet despite the dullness of bureaucracy, what was recognized was that it was through these institutional departments that the politics of knowledge was mobilized. Despite the standardization of scientific data protocols, not all countries in Asia are saved in high-res. Due to the large amount and complex data analysis techniques needed for remote sensing data, and due to low-speed networks on ground, many nation-states cannot afford satellite ground stations, data archives, and various other supporting infrastructures. So we understood that instead what was unintentionally indexed is a geopolitics of resolution, and that it was DEBAR's ambition to support such data-poor countries infrastructurally to increase resolutions and acquisitions of data. As Jennifer Gabrus wrote while quoting media theorist Marshall McLuhan, the Earth became programmable the moment that Sputnik was launched. Satellites allowed for new points of views which rendered visible Earth's spectral topographies. Acting as extensions of eyes, the satellites simultaneously signaled the rise of environmentalism as well as the distancing of the planet through a disembodied space view. It was in the 1970s when remote imagery had been inaugurally put to use in Tengchong, 49 years prior to the Third Digital Belton Conference that I mentioned just earlier. It was the first time Chinese scientists operationalized into infrared photography, making visible not only the spectral signatures of minerals, petroleum, coal resources, but also of pollution from urban and oceanic topographies. It was during these years, in late 1970s, that Mao Zedong's successor, Deng Xiaoping, had rerouted scientific and technological ambitions towards the economy instead of defense, transitioning China's integration into the global market. Within the laboratories of the Chinese Science Academy, a chemist, Xu Zhanxin, who had previously worked in the nuclear program, had applied his past research in the extraction of uranium isotopes towards the newer interest in the rare earth elements. He developed the theory of countercurrent extraction to separate 10 components of rare earth elements. What had crystallized then was a way to dramatically reduce the time and costs needed to extract rare earth minerals, catalyzing China into an industrial revolutionary boom. During the period of the 80s, Deng Xiaoping had launched Program 863 which took biotechnology, aerospace, aviation, electronics, automation, and energy as its focus, detaching China from its dependence on foreign technologies. Each of its departments demanded a high concentration of all 17 kinds of rare earth minerals. The aerospace technology department in particular embedded the minerals in satellites' very own sensors and coordination systems. Sorry. Infrastructures of remote sensing leads us to Inner Mongolia, into another test zone called Sichuan, this one designated for the launching of missiles and satellites. Situated within a closed-off area of the Gobi Desert, the Sichuan zone operates, launches, and conducts tests 300 days a year due to clear weather conditions. It is no strange coincidence that within the same province, cities like Baotou sit, which are amongst the largest cities focusing on rare earth mining industry. The province of Inner Mongolia already inscribes multiple materialities and communication-enabled technologies within its landscapes. Here, material states of rare earth element shift from solid mineral into liquid digital circuits. It is through laborers who mine them and the machines which transmit, the images of these territories feed back into its own transformation. There is, as Jussi Perica says, a double bind between knowing about the earth and the earth allowing that knowing to happen. Agendas of designing networks of sensors seeing into the earth's crust was twinned back by an outward extraterrestrial exploration, looking back into itself, where to extract one needs to go up into space, and in order to go up, one must go down to build more satellite apparatuses out from extraction. These landscapes expand in invisible and multiple ways and are already penetrated by multiple forms of visual inscription, visual forms of knowing, simultaneously forming as sites of extraction. Sean Cubitt refers to such assemblage of operations as geomedia, that both mediate the earth and establish a relation between time and value. They outline instances which draw representation not only of moving lands and atmospheres, but for potential relations to form and others to dissipate, catalyzing way of relating to environments. The visualizing of land and air coincides with broader geopolitical events, where together they can be seen as redrawing much of the organizational logic across the world's continents. As Parika writes, data is not only directly measured and registered, but it becomes dependent on the various distributed mechanisms that circulate data through simulations and other means of synthesis. The various Earth transformations that we witness are also mobilized as data, and as such, becomes oriented towards the future at least as much as the past that is only the record of changes. By the early 90s, the price of rare earth on the global market had dropped to nearly 1/4 of the United States due to the immense exporting of China's minerals. Japan, France, and other nation-states who previously held the monopolies on the market fell into production cuts and bankruptcies, sending shockwaves across global industrial chains. With europium emitting the intense beam of red light from TV screens, yttrium used in camera lenses, mobile phones containing neodymium, the growing production of electronics came with plurification in ways of seeing. Contemporary algorithmic geopolitics are still being defined by rare earth elements. As even Deng Xiaoping himself remarked, there is oil in the Middle East, there is rare earth in China. With geomedia being the articulation of various subjects produced through individual instruments, we only become aware of them, of the Earth's constant motion during pre-programmed events. When Gabrus spoke of the Earth's programmability, we can frame programming as a process which simultaneously opens and narrows possibilities for certain futures to be realized. Here, laboratories are not limited to scientific institutes, but extend across designated landscapes as test zones, each responding to the utterances of geomedia with a constant toggling of parameters until a desired modernity has been brought forth. These sensor-based technologies are not only environmentally located, they also inform and program environments, whether for managing or monitoring processes. Initiatives such as Digital Belt and Road are no exception, where they act as enablers for land and management through and from within geomedia, now with data-poor countries as prime frontiers. In 1996, a Chinese economist, Yu Guangxuan, wrote a seminal text where he proposed the ground exploitation of the earth along with its ground protection. He was no lesser than the speechwriter and economic advisor of Deng Xiaoping, and this essay, called The Smallness of the Earth and the Largeness of the Earth, had framed what he claimed to be the fundamental idea for the future 21st century construction. This text was both strange and intriguing, since what he managed to fold in was a hybridity of environmentalist rhetorics, which at first glance seemed completely at odds with one another. He conceptualized nature through ideas of smallness and largeness of the planet as an entity. The smallness of the Earth alluded to popular environmental concerns of its time, where Earth was to be protected for the survival of humankind dependent on it. As for the largeness of the Earth, you pointed out on the many resources on the Earth that have not yet been exploited. Whether this is doable, he writes, depends on our calculation and speculation on its profitability. The idea of exploitation alongside protection may not be as counterintuitive as one would think, as Yu's vision echoed the modernist ideal of the Earth as a holistic image, which is also an object of scientific construction. If accurately calculated, the entirety of the planet can be exploited with the effects following its exploitation able to be reverse engineered. What can be read within this short text was both an evolution of Marxist-Leninist thought of production as true measure of success, simultaneously resonating with the idea of sustainability that had been developed in the West. The Belt and Road Initiative currently provides green investments for countries along its geographies, granted when the conditions of the United Nations determined Sustainable Development Goals are met. But it still funds over $1 billion of USD of green finance into coal-related projects in the first half of this year alone. With these green rhetorics hinged on ideas of sustainability, we must remember that the term, which was first introduced by UN-convened World Commission on Environment and Development in 1987, suggested that technology and social organization can be both managed and improved to make way for a new era of economic growth. Upon its conception, it emphasized a responsibility which unifies the efforts needed to protect all of humanity's inherited ecologies, while framing the term sustainability within value registers defined first and foremost by economic needs. Value systems embed themselves within current geopolitical convenings where interpretation of how the Earth is changing are mattering on unprecedented planetary scales, triggering relocation of production, peoples, geological formations, and climates. Use concept of smallness and largeness synchronizes with the neoliberal greenness developed by the United Nations, each with their own nuances, latches on sustainable development as a term in which the scientist takes on a primary role. What is reinforced here is the scientists in their abilities to construct nature while further perpetuating a depoliticization of the ecological crisis by encouraging technologically innovative yet market-confirming solutions, managing societies and social integration as if for all people in all places on Earth. This Marxist-Leninist, Belt and Road, neoliberal, Al Gore, UN, Anthropocene, rhetorical hyper-hybrid has taken shape with trusted guidance of technocrats and scientists who have also caused a great deal of damage to the ecologies which have been primed for maximal production and extraction. This vision reinforces what T.J. Demos refers to as the techno-utopian position that we have indeed mastered nature, just as we have mastered its imaging. And in fact, the dual colonization of nature and representation, appear inextricably intertwined. If the digital Belt and Road summons to the use of big Earth data from across multiple connected infrastructures of planetary computation made operational in constructing quote-unquote interoperable modes and types of management and governance, the notion of the image here has already broadened, and so did the apparatus. Aerial imaging around Earth's orbit down to its deep ocean cables and embedded algorithmic operations constitute the collective form of imaging made from a bundle of cameras, sensors, and automated scanning routines, formulating this knowing of the Earth as ungraspable through a single image. The optics of this vastly distributed and largely dumb apparatus brings forth a predominantly algorithmic language in observing land, simultaneously reading the Earth's surface, potent with future, while programming them towards predefined ends, whether for corporate, military, or industrial. If these operations of images define the operations of time, we ask for whose futures is this being calculated towards? There is a recognition that changing climates are amongst the most volatile risks of the Belt and Road project. Disturbances felt from the Earth system are feeding back into political modeling across the Belt and Road, where new standards on green finance have been set by Chinese central government. The social environmental governance of loans, agreeable investments, and perceived risks have all been part of many nation states' recalibration efforts against these green standards. Yet these processes are not at all transparent, as well as the definitions of risk or of greenness. While the scientific excuse feeds in the general consensus on the need to collect data, the definitions vary in different protocols of sovereignty. Here, the totality of the image of an ecological crisis becomes, as Alain Badiou said, new opium for the masses, and is being further perpetuated and sustained, driving neoliberal economies and warfares that operate within the domains that are not necessarily visible and not territorial as we used to know them. Entering into many layers of the digital Belt and Road there is already an understanding for the prioritized efforts being made in centralizing databases and standardizing protocols for staff and machines. In spite of sustainability, when asking the questions of how futures are being programmed in the present, what needs to be held in the account are the power geometries being created as datasets are being accrued from geological formations, natural disasters, to social media behaviors and citizen biometrics. The Earth's nervous system is not a totality as it is claimed to be, but rather it is one articulation speaking through a distinct technological, ideological, and geopolitical vantage. This comes to a blatant relief when data asymmetries between the developed and developing are perpetuated, or when extractive frontiers are still being expanded through data, each with inherent biases in value metrics. A digital Earth is indeed a spectacular thought, but by unpacking its distributed elements, its shaky truth and structured subjectivities make these systems less holistic than one would think. The instability can be rather seen as possible entry points for mobilizing the redrawing of relations, these being as much a social as it is an aesthetic politics. To conclude, with Geocinema, we find important to refer to these narratives to fracture this totality of a future led by projects such as D-Bar, and to instead recognize the partial, the always fragmented, and the mediated through various uneven experiences. If futures are being literally programmed by means of imaging and imagination, looking at techniques of the imaging apparatuses themselves to see how it has been recording, or rather co-producing histories of Earth, can provide clues on how to recontextualize things that already exist, to tease out what relations are missing then, towards other planetary connections. So I'll leave you here to this final clip that will take you back to the calibration rooms. Thank you.